So, for better or for worse, I'm sure for some you will be jumping for joy, and for others you will be sad. This will be our last class on who wrote the Bible.
It's the last class.
So will you reveal today who wrote the Bible?
Nope. Maybe.
No.
Haven't decided yet.
And what's next?
Take a vote.
Men under the direction of God.
What's next? Why did they do it? Why did they write it? Come into Egypt and tell Sarah to be his sister. And then Pharaoh ends up being intimate with Sarah and gets in trouble afterward. That it is in that moment that Abraham amasses a whole bunch of wealth, including male and female slaves. So it's the only reference in the entire Torah to Abraham amassing that kind of wealth from this experience while he's in Egypt and amassing specifically male and female slaves. Who must have been the female slave that he... Hagar. So in theory, the whole drama that unfolds between Abraham and Sarah and Hagar really starts not with Hagar, but with the way that Abraham tells Sarah to be his sister. And as a result of that whole thing going awry, he ends up acquiring female servants, including Hagar, who will end up becoming the person who comes back to cause all of this tsuris for Sarah. And that all kind of unfolds underneath the surface. I didn't put that together until I started with the Friday morning group, reading the Parsha verse by verse, 3-4 years ago. And when we got to that part, I started making different connections and parallels that I'd never seen before. And I think that one of the cool things about reading Torah is that every time you read it, you see something different. And so in many ways, the question may not be who wrote it, but why do we read it? And what do we get out of it every time we read it? Why is it that we just started again? Why are we doing Genesis again? So why do you think this act of reading scripture, of reading Torah, of reading the Hebrew Bible, has become so pivotal, so much the focal point of what we do and who we are? Yeah.
I think it's because the Torah stays the same, but we change, and it's a way for us to measure our change.
Great. So I think that's a great answer. Any others? Yeah?
Torah is about learning, and that's why when Ezra reads the whole Torah to coming back from Babylonia, we forget. And if you're going to learn something that's important, it's important to keep reviewing it so that you won't forget.
Right. Yeah?
I think Torah allows for a certain amount of homogeneity between Jews living in different places, where we wind up having different customs and different dress, but we can all go back to a common entity, which reminds us that we have to be anchored somehow, despite the diversity that the world imposes on us.
Great.
that's
Yeah, Linda?
peoplehood.
I'm not saying this to be flip, but I belong to a Jane Austen society, and I belong to a local Jane Austen book club, and we read the same, not 5 books, 6 books, over and over and over again. And the slower one reads it, the more one sees that, oh, she did say this at the beginning, which led to this happening later. She set the foundation. So we talk about it, we analyze it. I learn something new every time. Then I forget it, but and that's one of the reasons I think we read the Torah over and over again, is because we forget.
Right. Yeah.
I also think that it grounds us in our history. It's not that we're just here and now or 1 or 2 generations back,
Roots.
but it gives us the long context, and that things that seem so important and immediate now, viewed in the historical context, you get a perspective that you don't have if you don't have that historical.
Right. I'm just curious, if at the end of this class I told you the answer to the question, would that change anything for you?
I'd forget
Ellen?
it.
Well,
You'd forget it.
What question?
Until you read it again.
What
If I asked you the question, who wrote the Bible, and then I told you at the end of the class the answer, like I gave you an answer, would it change anything for you?
Well, it wouldn't change it, because what this whole class has done for me anyway is really increased my fascination with Torah more than anything, because I don't care that it was written by different authors or any of that now. It's interesting and I like the historical perspective, but the way these stories interconnected and the way this went to that, and in a way what you were just saying is just fascinating to me. And the meaning, it just enhanced the meaning for me, as opposed to diminishing it in any way. It didn't matter that it was different authors or different times. It just was fascinating that it could have such meaning and connectedness through the 5 books. And so for me, this class has only enhanced in a number of ways my reading of Torah.
Right.
I think for certain Jews, traditional Jews, they firmly believe that Moses wrote the 5 books of Torah. That's a fundamental
Right.
belief with, and if you stray from that, Jews have become excommunicated at times for that.
Right, it's called the 5 books of Moses.
So if finding out that Moses didn't write these books disturbs you, it's a problem.
Mm.
But for people who are less concerned about that,
Yeah.
it's maybe more interesting.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Yeah. So David Steinberg, who is the one who created TABS, Torah and Biblical Scholarship, and really invited a panoply of scholars to come and start writing these essays, some of which we've read over the course of the year. I spoke to him at one point, and I think through Phil, and I told him about the class I took in college called Intro to the Hebrew Bible Old Testament. It was a class where we were exploring the academic understanding of how the Bible was compiled. And I remember having a moment sometime toward the beginning of the class where my professor, Rabbi Dr. Pamela Barmash, introduced the idea of the documentary hypothesis and of multiple authorship, that I went back to her office afterward and I cried in her office. Because I grew up going to a Jewish day school, I went K through 12, and I was taught largely by, Orthodox rabbis who were a part of the Kollel and the Orthodox community, even some conservative rabbis, but they tended to be more rabbinic in terms of their teaching, so Mishnah and Talmud and whatnot. And so I really had one worldview of how everything came into being. And this kind of opened my eyes to another form of study about the text. Not only one form of study, right? I could appreciate how this discipline, this academic understanding of the text could be for someone their way of interpreting Bible, of interpreting scripture and the Torah. And for others, it's like, no, I don't need this because God did it for me, right? Or I don't need either of those because I really just love looking at the commentaries, or I really love the history, I really love the archaeology, or whatever it is. And for me, it just opened up another door that there was another way to explore this text, right? You can read it just the pshat. You can read it with the midrash. You can look at it verse by verse. You can start looking at the parallels. You can look at it in its historical or political or geopolitical contexts. You can look at all of those things. You can look at it through El or Yahweh or Adonai or whatever. And each one kind of unlocks a different mystery of the text. So for me, it's that magic that I think is really captivating and why I like it. More than a decade ago, David Wolpe, who's the rabbi of Sinai in LA, he wrote a very controversial sermon, which I wrote a sermon about a couple of years ago, about whether or not the Exodus really happened. And he offers a couple of reasons for the justification of it, but the crux of the sermon is, does it matter? Okay, so I wanted to read 2 things that I wrote about in reflecting on his sermon. One is whether or not, amidst the theological hurricane that it creates, those were his words, if it even makes a difference. And he says the following: the Torah is not a book we turn to for historical accuracy, but rather for truth. The story of the Exodus lives in us. Standing at the Passover Seder, I see in my mind's eye the Israelites marching out of Egypt, the miracles of the sea, the pillar of the fire leading them through the fearful night. I feel an enormous gratitude to God, for although we cannot know exactly how God has saved our people, we have been saved. Despite unimaginable odds and opposition, the Jewish people have seen a nation after nation buried under debris of history, while our nation lives. Here is where archaeology, history, scholarship, and scripture meet. Am Yisrael Chai, the nation of Israel, remains alive. So that was one of the justifications that he gave for it doesn't necessarily matter, right? It's the meaning that we have derived from that story. And everyone knows the story of Passover. Everyone knows the story of, Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur. We don't necessarily remember what Shmini Atzeret is, but that's, aside. But we remember these stories and we keep coming back to them. And then there was another piece that I talked about, which is about faith and about theology. One of the things I think we try to ignore by talking only about this is the whole other side of what do we believe and what do we think and what do we feel about what this inspires us to do. So I'll give you an example on multiple extremes. You got Phil over here, okay? This is Phil's Bible. This is what Phil believes, right? The historical academic approach to the text resonates very deeply. For others, it's the fact that God wrote it, and that God did it, and that God made it happen, and that's enough. And for others, it's about the structure, right? It's about the way that it resonates with our lives and the ebbs and the flows, and it's about the story, and it's about the ethics, and it's about how we live. You can pick whichever one you want. I also think it's about what you believe. You can't read the text in isolation of making you think about your faith and your doubt and your belief and your anger and your frustration and all of the different ways that the Torah speaks to what we think about God, whether we believe in God or don't believe in God. And I say that knowing that there are atheists in the room. Yes, I'm looking at you. Okay? But I think that's also a beautiful piece. And so James Fowler made a very interesting point about how reading the Torah is really about pushing the limits of us thinking about our own belief system. And maybe that should be another way of exploring the why we read it, or how in reading it we somehow change who we are. He says, we begin to question, to prod, to challenge our faith, ultimately causing it to crumble before our eyes. That's what happened to me in college. Subsequently, one can reach second naivete, a renewed sense of faith with more sophisticated, nuanced understanding of one's tradition. And so I think in some ways that's also what happens when you do this.
We evolve.
Yeah, you evolve, we evolve, even the text evolves, right? We realize in reading it that there's evolution in the text. The God at the beginning, forget who authored it, is not the same God as when God meets Abraham, when God meets Isaac and Jacob, when God meets Moses at the bush, when God meets the Israelites after they get in trouble every time, right? God changes too. God is also dynamic in that. And so I was thinking about all of those pieces and trying to pull together what we have been doing, because I know that for some, this was a really hard class, right? And for others, it was really gratifying, and for some, it was kind of in between. There were parts that resonated more strongly, and for others, it not as much. Yeah.
Just wonder, what you said could apply very well to reading the evening newspaper.
How so?
I mean, there are stories over there, and you can make you reflect on the ethics, on how people behave, and how all that also comes up, and how different cultures are interacting.
Right.
So I mean, that introspection that can happen from reading Jane Austen.
Right.
Can happen from reading newspaper or whatever, something mundane even. It doesn't have to be.
Right.
But of course, this is a nice collection. It forces you to reflect also.
Right. Yeah. Phil?
That's borderline heretical to me, because the news comes and goes. But the Torah is eternal, right? Because once it was solidified in text, after thousands of years of people going over it and integrating it. So I wouldn't say actually that this book is like the only way I look at it. What I would say is that the way I look at it is that it's a solid part of our religion, that we all study the same thing, but we all bring something different to it. And when we study it, we all have to study it together. So we can't get caught up in our own thought. We have to think what other people think about it, so that it's Torah means teaching, and it's a teaching on good and bad through stories. A newspaper article doesn't really capture that. It's just telling you, hey, this is what happened today. But it doesn't have this kind of narrative of behavior and good and bad
So I want to see if I can actually bridge the two. If we want to hold for just a moment that the text that we read is a series of different texts that have been strung together, then in some way what it actually was a series of articles that were written over time, that someone then decided to say, we're going to bring them together to write as our story, a broad story narrative, and to put it together in one full book that people can come back to over and over again as one way of telling the story. Now, clearly what we've seen over the year is that every author, JEPD, DTR1, 2, whatever it is, redactor, each one had their own piece of the story that they wanted to highlight. But whoever it was that made it happen in its final form, I kind of wonder if it was actually the opposite sometimes, where human beings started writing the whole thing, and God said, you know what, you just created a mess, let me fix it and put it together for you. Right? And God took all of the pieces and reordered it in a way that created this beautiful thing that was rich and deep and complicated. But, you know, he started with what we were feeling and kind of harmonized it in a way. And so I wonder actually if, you know, each time we read it, what we're seeing is another article that made it out from the evening news in some ways. And over time people said, you know what, these stories fit together. There's common threads. And let's put them together to tell a whole story where every time we tell it, we can relate it to another article that's coming out in the news or into the world or into our lives or whatnot.
I think Siva's point was really interesting about why did they write it, and it was important enough that they kept these stories for hundreds of years before they were able to write them down, before they had the means to do it.
Right.
But that it was important enough to all of these people who got together and put it all together.
Right. I mean, for all we know, this was an original Jane Austen book.
It could be the Hawaiians, you know, they didn't have a written language. So
Right.
for hundreds of years, they had to pass down. A lot of cultures are like that.
Sure,
They had
sure.
to be passed down.
And then
And
it's,
then
finally it's
somebody
written,
came.
somebody comes, right?
Well,
right.
maybe it's a human need to wanna know where
Yep.
you come from.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
that's why these things persist orally or.
And in some ways, that's the truth that I think that Wolpe was trying to get at, or that Fowler was trying to get at, is that we want to understand why we're here and what we're doing and how we live and what this all means and how we interact with each other, and is there any order to this chaos? Yeah.
Well, not only do all humans have the same needs, and I think it would be worth listing those needs, because really there are not very many.
Right.
And on top of that, or just as important, is how human relations work in terms of the big ideas like power.
Sure.
So the idea of power, how power works, that's how I see these details of what you just said, that all of a sudden Abraham got these riches. Wow.
Right.
That is really, in my mind, connected to what's going on in today's newspaper.
Right, but I think to your point, Steve, it's actually quite humbling if we, as a theological tool, say that human beings can never be more powerful than God.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
If we can take the human component of power out of the equation and say, you know what, even though we compete, right? The Tower of Babel in some ways is a story all about power.
Yeah.
They build a tower to try to show their superiority to everybody else in a physical kind of way. And what happens? They get humbled pretty quickly by getting knocked down and scattered throughout the world.
Yeah.
And in some ways, that's kind of what is happening in the struggle between polytheism and monotheism and kind of monolatry. Right? Can we humble ourselves to say that we actually are not more powerful than anybody else or than God, and that there are consequences when you try to take your power to certain limits, you know, or no limits. Yeah.
I think one of the things that I learned that was difficult for me was the politics that's in Torah, and specifically the battle between, let's say, the Mushite line of of Moses and the priestly line
Right.
for dominance.
Mm-hmm.
And that certainly takes it out of the realm of holiness into the realm of everyday reality.
Yep.
And that's a different, that's a challenging way of looking at Torah.
Right? Yeah. I completely agree. Okay, so what I thought we would do is we should read the end of Torah. Okay? So let's go to Bezot HaBracha, which is the very last chapter. It's the last two chapters, but we're going to look at chapter 34 in particular. I'm on page 1210. This is after all of the various blessings, which are worthy in and of themselves of their own study.
12:10.
And I actually want to, if you have Friedman's Revealing the Sources, I want to look at it also there, because one of the interesting things about the last verses of Deuteronomy, of the Torah, is that they're actually authored by multiple authors all in one piece, according to Friedman's way of looking at it. But what I'm more interested in is what happens at the end, and if there really is even an end. Okay, because what's the first thing that we do theologically or ritually speaking when we finish reading the Torah?
Again.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that ordinarily on a Shabbat, right, or a festival, when you read out of two Torahs, what do you do to separate the reading from the first Torah to the second Torah?
You say Kaddish.
You say Chatzi Kaddish, right? Creating literally a hefsek, a break, between the main reading and the separate reading, the additional reading for that holiday. On Simchat Torah, we do not recite a Chatzi Kaddish between the last Aliyah in finishing Deuteronomy and the first Aliyah of reading from Breshit. It's one continuous reading. The only reason that we pause is because we're not going to roll the whole thing back, so we switch Torahs. But it's considered to be one continuous cycle. No end, no beginning, just goes on and on and on. Okay, so we're going to read
chapter to the heart of it, right? Literally. That goes to the heart of
Well,
it.
that's, you're playing on the word.
Yeah.
Right. So the last word in the Torah is Yisrael, which ends with a lamed, and the first word of Genesis is Breshit, which begins with a bet. The lamed and the bet make lev. Okay, so that's the heart of the matter.
Wow.
Okay, so
You didn't tell us the page here.
page 367 in the Friedman, page 1210 in the red. It's almost like what happened at the very end is that all of the authors finally said, you know what, let's write this one together.
So how they get together in time?
There's no time in
Middle of the
Torah.
space.
What's that?
Across them.
All right, so Barbara, you want to read?
Sure.
Let's read out of the Friedman just so that you can see the authorship pieces here.
And Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, the top of Pisgah, which is facing Jericho. And Yahweh showed him all of the land, Gilead to Dan, and all of Naphtali, and the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, and all the land of Judah to the far sea, and the Negev and the plain, the valley of Jericho, the city of palms, to Zoar. And Yahweh said to him, This is the land that I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, saying, I'll give it to your seed. I've caused you to see it with your eyes, but you won't cross there.
Okay, so what do we have in the final, or in the opening verses of this final chapter? What's happening here?
Sounds like Lion King. Versus everything the sun shines will be yours.
That's true. Good. So what is that a recollection of or a reminder of?
Fulfillment of the covenant.
Good. This is the fulfillment of the covenant. Okay? God references in this particular case Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now we're going to get there. What else does it represent?
Also says that Moses, you're not going to go there.
Yes. So we do have the fulfillment of the promise that God said you're not going to enter the land. What else?
Mount Sinai, going up and receiving.
Yeah. So there's a similar element of going up, right? That we had similar to Revelation. What else?
Well, it's the beginning of the people. Again, it's going to be not yours, it's this
Yes,
people.
that's right. And we also have here a hint at the unity of all of the different aspects of the northern and the southern kingdoms on both sides of the Jordan, right? So you have Judah that's mentioned. You have tribes in the north, but you also have the tribes of Manasseh that are and that is going to remain on the other side of the Jordan. You're going to see the whole property line here, apolitically, as if to suggest the covenant both exists during the political upheaval that we've studied historically, and it transcends that time, both before and after. Okay, go ahead, Barbara.
One other thing that it
Yeah.
transcends is the fact that the people is going to go on. The people is going to go on without Moses.
Yes.
And it means that this gathering is not about the leader.
Correct. Yes, that is right. It is about the people. It's always been about the people. It will continue to always be about the people.
And there's
Okay.
legitimacy for future leaders.
Yes.
And Moses, Yahweh's servant, died there in the land of Moab by Yahweh's mouth. And he buried him in the valley of the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor. And no man knows his burial place to this day. And Moses was 120 years old at his death. His eye was not dim, and his vitality had not fled.
Okay. So notice the authorship here.
Yeah.
It's J.
Yeah.
It's sad. We, by the way, now have a set time limit of life. Right? This is where we get the expression that you to live until 120.
This isn't Bereshit.
Well, yes and no, except that in parts of Genesis, people live to 900 and change.
But after Garden of Eden, God says that
That their time will be limited. Correct.
120 years.
That's right. So we have a bookend to creation. Right? And what else do we know about the end of his life?
Well, he was vital.
Yes.
Yeah. Till the very end. That's how we should be living.
How is this different than other sources we've seen where people are at their deathbed?
Well, they're giving blessings and.
They're giving blessings, but think about Isaac. Huh? They're blind. Many of the people, when they die, the patriarchal figures, when they die, they're blind, they can't see. That's what gets Isaac into trouble. He can't see. At least he says he can't see. Right? So there are these moments where sight is actually dimmed in death, and in this case, it actually says, no, the opposite. He has vitality. He can see. He's able to witness, if you will, which we've seen previously before in the last few chapters of Deuteronomy, how things are serving as witnesses, as a sign, if you will. Yeah.
Well, I think it's interesting that no one will know where Moses is buried. It's sort of like, with this incredible figure, but you're not going to raise him up so much and make him somehow
An image of God.
Yes,
Yes.
exactly. You're not
Worshipping
going
at
to
his grave
substitute that, and I think that's, to me, what's striking about it.
Right, so there's a real humanness to this piece. However, the next verses...
I mean,
Say it again?
God buries him.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there's a very intimate connection here between God and Moses.
It
By the
also
way,
suggests that God killed him. It says he died by
it
Yahweh's
says Al
mouth.
Pi Adonai, which is a complicated phrase because it means that you could say God caused him to die, or it's by the fulfillment of this command by God.
Well, we know he's not sick. He has vitality.
Right.
But he died by his Yahweh's
command.
mouth.
Yes. He dies by Yahweh's mouth, is buried by God, and nobody knows where he is.
It's almost like, for whatever purpose he was put on earth, God determined that was done.
Yes.
And now
Or-
he was going to remove him for all the reasons he
That's right.
said.
And you have this parallel of the Sinaitic revelation of going up on the mountain. Who's on the mountain with God? It's only Moses.
So
It's
who
the
wrote
two
the
of them.
story?
Huh?
So who wrote the story?
Right, so the scholars will say that either Joshua wrote this part,
Yeah.
or depending on when Deuteronomy was written, it may have been Jeremiah. But yeah, we interpret it as Joshua from a traditional perspective, because he's the one who's just handed the
Right.
baton, if you will, and you'll see in just a second that Joshua takes over kind of full vigor. Yeah.
I think sight can also be a metaphor for vision, both Moses' vision and God's vision.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
Does die by Yahweh's mouth mean that Yahweh emitted, spoke, and he died?
So,
It's a really great question. It's not clear. It says, Al pi Adonai, according to the mouth, literally the mouth, or could be also the word of
but
God.
that's how he blew the
Breath
breath into the person.
That's right.
Puff.
That's right.
And now
Vayipach
it's-
be'apav, right? So God blows through the nostrils. So
So
it's
now he's
also
just taking it out.
great. So you're starting to pick up on some of the parallelism that exists in the concluding parts with the beginning
Earlier,
parts.
right.
Okay. So verse 8. I just want to read it. Actually, you can read 8 through 9.
And the children of Israel mourned Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. And the days of weeping, the mourning of Moses, ended. And Joshua son of Nun was full of the spirit of wisdom, because Moses had laid his hands on him. And the children of Israel listened to him, and they did as Yahweh commanded Moses.
So now we have something that's priestly.
Yeah.
We mourned Aaron for 30 days. And notice what Moses does, or at least the way that it's described here. There is the placing of the hands.
Hands.
Okay, that's exactly what the priests do when they go underneath the talit and they do their thing, right? They're bestowing something on us. And the word that's actually used in verse 9, it says, V'Yoshua bin Nun maleh ruach chokhmah. He was filled with spirit of wisdom. Ki samach Moshe et yadav. The word samach, if you've ever heard as someone becoming a rabbi that you say they get smicha, that's samach, right? That's where it comes from. The placing of the hands is the act of smicha. And so he was endowed with this particular ability to be able to now lead the people. And so this is actually written by the priests. All right, and then let's read the final verses, please.
And a prophet did not rise again in Israel like Moses, whom Yahweh knew face to face, with all the signs and the wonders that Yahweh sent him to do in the land of Egypt to Pharaoh and to all his servants and to all his land, and with all the strong hand and with all the great fear that Moses made before the eyes of all Israel.
Okay. Now I just want to show you Friedman's note, because his note is a great connection, I think, to what we've been trying to uncover about authorship and parallelism. He says the final section is DTR1. It uses the expression did not rise like him. Lo kam navi od b'Yisrael. Another one didn't arise like him, which is applied only to two people in all of Tanakh. To Moses here and to King Josiah.
Right.
Right? A description of that king. What do we know about King Josiah? According to academic historical,
He founded the Book of Teaching.
he found and perhaps even wrote or at least reconstituted Deuteronomy.
Right.
All right? And in similar ways, the way that Deuteronomy ends is also giving credence to Moses as that kind of leader and to Josiah in the recommitting of the people to the covenant, right? To the Sefer HaBrit. Yeah.
Isn't it Friedman's theory that this book was, it doesn't really end in authorship?
Not
with
at all.
Deuteronomy, it continues through
Right into Joshua.
all the way to Joshua.
That's correct.
And Joshua is the fulfillment
That's right.
of the Tanakh.
Yes, and by the way, the Haftorah that we read on Simchat Torah is the first chapter of Joshua. And so, yeah, that's what Friedman is arguing in that article that I gave to some of you last week, that there really isn't an end to the Torah. It just keeps going with more of the story in wanting to be able to perpetuate what it is that you did. By the way, the verse 10 becomes kind of the cornerstone of Maimonides' 13 Pillars of Faith. Okay, so Yigdal, some of you know that piyut, that poem, has in it, Lo kam b'Yisrael k'Moshe od navi umabit et temunato. No one else ever arose as a prophet like Moses did, who was able to see in the way or have the kind of the divine ability to perceive in the way that he did. So
It doesn't mean that there were no other prophets, but none like him.
correct. And in particular, the Torah qualifies it. It's not just that there wasn't another one like him. There was another one, Asher Yida'o Adonai Panim El Panim, who
right.
knew the Lord,
Face to
Yahweh,
face.
face to face.
Which is such a conflict because otherwise it says that you cannot see my face and live.
That's
And he
right.
puts them into the cloud.
And the question is, does Moses ever see God's face?
No.
His face glows.
Good.
Yes.
So he never sees God face to face. God actually says, in putting Moses in the cleft of the
crevice,
rock, you
right.
can only see
My
my back. But when Moses comes down the mountain, how does he appear to the people? Radiant. His face shows to the people as if he had seen God's face.
What's the Hebrew word for radiant? Then?
Karan or,
Oh.
which by the way, if you
I
change
thought it was Ziva.
Ziv, well, Ziv means radiant also, Ziv, right? But in this case, it's Karan or. And by the way, if you change it from Karan or to Karen or, it means the horns. So that's
The
where
what?
that stereotype comes from. Horns.
That's why sometimes you see Moses drip.
With
With
horns.
Michelangelo has
Okay.
a famous statue of
Why
Moses
would
with
God
horns.
ever think we needed another leader like Moses? There have been periods in our history where it would have been helpful.
Right. So that's an interesting question. And we could take it from two different angles, at least two different angles. One is, why doesn't God think we would need another leader? Or why does God think we're not worthy of another leader? But another angle is, if we as human beings have some role in the authorship of this text, it is our perception that since Moses, there was never anyone like Moses. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Well, there would be Christians that would disagree with you because.
No,
Jesus
for sure. But let's talk about it. If we
But
only look,
from
if we
our
say that
perspective-
Josiah is the person who's writing this text, or it's at least being written 500-600 years after Moses dies, that in their eyes there was no prophet like Moses up until that point. Doesn't mean that there couldn't be one in the future. The way that we've interpreted it is that there is only one Moses, and there will never be another Moses. And there was only one Moses who had the relationship with God the way that Moses did. We never will be able to. Yeah.
Sometimes we talk about the Exodus story and the rest of the Torah as the evolution of, well, first, from a tribe, a family to a nation. But that nation is a nation really of children.
Yes.
And, the children of Israel. And that there's a certain maturity has to occur. And that Moses' role in taking this band of people, these almost childlike people, and converting them almost to our faith, creating that faith,
Right.
brings them to a certain point where we're supposed to be sufficiently mature, maybe not to need the same type of prophet any longer. That's debatable.
I have a comment that.
Well, by the way, to your point, when you start reading the major and the minor prophets, what you see is that prophets don't actually work so well.
Right.
Right? These are human beings who are trying to convey a particular message, mostly ethical in nature or moral in nature, and they're most often laughed at or pushed aside and not believed. And so the role of the prophet becomes quite challenging. Moses experiences a piece of that in his life, for sure, but there was a reverence for him, at least the way that the Torah conveys it, that I don't know existed for the other prophets in the same way. At least not all of them. Yeah.
I think I would like to link into what you said, another reason for the significance of the Torah. I think if you think about how difficult it is for one generation to connect and pass on wisdom to the next generation, the Torah is a way in which each generation it's a medium through which each generation has communicated with not only the next generation, but sequential generations. And in that sense, it's kind of unique. There aren't many, I think customs do that in a certain way.
The Magid.
Folk dancing does it in a certain way. The musical heritage of a people does that in a certain way. It bridges generations. But the Torah, more than anything else I can think of, has created a bridge from whoever left Egypt, if anybody left Egypt, to people through Rome and the Galut and the Artsot Habri.
Right.
There's nothing I can think of that does that.
Right?
Was done in essence.
Yeah.
One last thing is, this has an angelic vibe to it,
Mhm.
where, an angel is sent to do one thing, and they come and they do it, and then they go away.
Mhm.
And I think this is intentionally creating that impression.
Sure, and in some ways that was Moses' task. Moses' task was to take the people out of Egypt and get them to the land.
Right.
He did so successfully. Don't get me wrong, there were bumps and bruises along the way, but that was his job, right? And now it's on to somebody else. It's almost like it has elements of the scene of Jacob's ladder, right? Where there were the angels going up and down. And Rashi, says that was about a changing of the guard, meaning that There were angels that could take Jacob only up to a point, and then there had to be new angels that kind of come in and take over from when they get out of bounds of the land. So, yeah.
Well, I just want to point out that the word Israel means to struggle with God,
Right.
right? So it ends with, that's the last word, and it's about continuing the struggle.
That's right. So I wanted to leave you with a piece that I referenced a couple years ago. It's from a teacher of mine, Helfand, who is a rabbi. He's a conservative rabbi, he's a tremendous scholar. And he wrote, this was also kind of in response to Wolpe's kind of claim. He didn't write it in response to that, I used it in that way. And he says the following: even in an age when God splits seas, as described in the Exodus, the Torah places tremendous emphasis on human beings taking the first step. God will not save the Israelites unless and until they are willing to go forward into the unknown.
Right.
It is only once the Israelites act boldly and dauntlessly that God's miraculous interventions set in. Times have changed. In our day, God does not split seas or accompany Israel in a cloud. God's presence is more subtle and elusive, God's involvement more mysterious. If in a time when God's saving presence was manifest, people were nevertheless called upon to take matters into their own hands, all the more so are we required to do so now, in a time when God's presence is hidden or even absent. What was necessary in biblical times, therefore, is all the more urgent today. People are called upon to refuse passivity as a religious posture. Faith sometimes demands a willingness to let go, but even more often it requires the courage to act.
Right.
So I was thinking about that because I think that oftentimes the purpose of the study is for its own sake, but also it is to help us act differently in terms of how we live our lives and in terms of how we interact with the world. So I'll leave you with that and more to ruminate over.